It hadn't taken us the full week to set out thanks to Leith's familiarity with the Empire of Calcutti. I only had to wait 3 days before we hit the road. It was much easier to bear than Nash's training. Every time we stopped for lunch, he would drill me on the basics, and then have me attempt to copy his movements. Then he would attack me while I tried to use the movements he demonstrated to parry him. It hadn't gone well, and he was getting grumpier with each failed session. Soon he would reach a critical mass of grumpiness and either explode or implode, likely taking the whole solar system with him. A supernova or black hole powered completely by grumpiness. Thankfully, our journey was nearing its end. For now, at least. The first signs of civilization came into view, and I decided to take a brief nap to speed things along. When I awoke, we were on city streets. Buildings of stone and metal surrounded us, and dwarves were going about their daily routines. Well, mostly dwarves. Every now and then there would be a gnome, orc, or elf doing something, but they were few and far between. It was easy to tell that this was a dwarven city, even without the obvious architecture differences from the other cities I'd been to. "So, where are we headed, Leith?" Nash asked. "Figured I'd drop you at the Venator's bureau so you can ask around while I park the cart," our dwarven driver answered. "I'll meet you there once I'm done." "Venator's bureau?" I asked. "Is that like the Adventurers Guild?" "Sort of. The VB is focused on monsters and doesn't usually take requests, though. The other big differences are that they only do contracts and don't allow solo adventurers to sign up. You need to be in a party of at least 3 and sign a contract to do work for them." "Why are we asking them questions instead of going to the Adventurers Guild?" "Because the AG is on the whole other fucking side of town," Leith laughed. "Plus, the AG is a lot less focused on dungeons around here. They focus more on requests, which usually end up being protection or gathering jobs. That's mostly because the dungeons in Calcutti don't have much treasure, so the profit is strictly in monster guts. So if you want to know all there is to know about dungeons, the VB is your best bet. And here they are." The cart rolled to a stop in front of a building that looked similar to the others, but with a lot more gold trim. Thanks to the tables and chairs off to the side of the building, it gave off a tavern-like aura. We hopped out of the cart, and Leith gave us a wave before he took off down the road again. "Well, the dwarf's logic seems sound," Nash muttered. "Let's find somebody who works here." We entered the building and the tavern vibe immediately intensified. The inside of the Venator's Guild looked almost exactly like the taverns often depicted in video games and anime, right down to the bar and patrons. The only real difference was the amount of gold trim. There was a lot more of it on the inside than there was on the outside. I couldn't tell if we'd walked into a booze hall or a treasure vault. Once a few patrons did their obligatory double takes at my appearance, the room went quiet. Thankfully, it felt more like a shocked silence than a suspicious one. Nash chuckled as we approached the bartender and/or receptionist. The orc behind the bar watched us approach while shuffling some papers. "Greetings," he said. "Pleasure or business?" "Business," I replied. "We'd like information on the dungeons around here." Nash gave me an annoyed glance while I stepped forward and took a seat at the bar. "Yeah, we can do that. You able to read?" "Not any languages that anybody seems to write in," I laughed. "Fair enough. Figured you weren't from around here. Y'all want a drink while you ask your questions?" "Yes," Yolk said. "Whatever's on tap will be fine. Any allergies?" We looked at each other and shook our heads. "Good. 4 meads coming up." The bartender busied himself with pouring the drinks while Nash, Yulk, and Elmira took their seats. I watched as he poured, wondering if I should say anything about my age. After he poured the second glass, all the conditioning my mother had instilled within me finally kicked in. "You know, back home I'm not old enough to drink alcohol," I said. "How old are you?" Elmira asked. 18. Well, last I checked. 18 years old and doesn't know how to parry properly, Nash sighed. "Your people must have it pretty damn easy." "Is it a cultural taboo or a medical necessity?" Yolk asked. "Cultural, I think. Legal drinking age in my country is 21, but in other countries it's lower. Plus, the law doesn't prohibit parents giving you alcohol, at least not in my state." Your country has multiple countries? Elmira asked. Like an empire? Before I could answer, 4 mugs slid down the bar and slowed to a stop in front of each of us one by one. My eyes widened as the bartender returned to his previous position. Elmira and my brothers seemed unimpressed, though. How'd you do that? I asked. Practice, the orc smirked. So what are you wanting to know? How many dungeons are nearby? Nash asked. Only the one. It was considered neutralized until just a few hours ago, actually. Neutralized? Well, the last time the dungeon was spewing monsters was over a decade ago. Contractors that went to explore it reported traps and kobolds who seemed to have a leader, but no loot or monsters worth a damn. Kobolds aren't worth anything? Maybe to a collector, but you get a lot more of the good stuff from their bigger cousins, and you don't have to listen to them yap at you. Plenty of folk take issue with hunting things that talk, too. Since the kobolds weren't bothering anybody, the decision was made to leave well enough alone. What are the kobolds' bigger cousins? I asked. Reptians and sauroids. Reptians are about as big as I am and have a neurotoxic venom that causes a total body paralysis, which can lead to death via asphyxiation. They travel in groups, have 6-inch claws, and hunt by spitting their venom at their victim and ripping them to shreds once they're paralyzed. Sauroids are much bigger and kinda look like a mix between a kobold and a troll. With a much bigger mouth, though. They're solitary ambush predators that usually try to eat their victims whole. Both make for damn good hunts. So why is the dungeon no longer considered neutralized? Nash asked. We've been having a bunch of disappearances, far more than normal. A couple from here in town, but mostly out on the road near the dungeon. Couple of adventurers found evidence that the victims had been taken into the dungeon, so we sent some of our own to check it out. He gestured over to the corner. My gaze followed his wave and saw a massive orc, 3 dwarves, an elf, and upright lizard that was happily eating a chunk of meat. It was my turn for an obligatory double-take. They brought back a kobold that claims the dungeon has been taken over by vampires, at least 7 of them. The Western Wasters are brave, but not stupid. That's far too many vampires for 5 adventurers to handle. They made their way back to report, and we reclassified the dungeon as active. A somber silence settled over us at the mention of vampires. Rezun had spared no detail when he explained what had happened in our absence. My first thought was that the vampire that had led the drow may have taken refuge in the dungeon, but Rezun had said that half-breed vampires aren't able to make more. Something weird is going on here. Do you think the disappearances in town were due to the vampires? Nash asked. I don't know. It's hard to believe that they could make it through the gates, especially since there's a nightly curfew. An odd feeling, like a soft nudge, tugged at the back of my mind. Too many coincidences. We're looking for dungeons that were inhabited by the cult. My brother's homeland was attacked by a vampire, and there's a dungeon with vampires on our first stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that it's been waiting for us, somehow. We should talk to them, I said. I feel like this might be the dungeon we're after. You gonna take a drink of your mead first? Nash grinned. I looked at my untouched mug of mead. My friends back home hadn't been the type to throw parties with booze, so the only time I'd ever had any was the beer my dad shared with me on my 18th birthday. The bitter taste of the beer echoed in my mouth, and I felt my stomach churn. Yeah, of course, I said, picking up the mug. Don't worry, I'll prevent inebriation, Ten said. Thanks. I took a deep breath and chugged the contents of the mug. It was much sweeter than I expected, but it burned a little going down. Once the mug was finished, I set it down and wiped my mouth. Once my sleeve left my mouth, a loud burp forced its way out. Nice, the bartender chuckled. Nash raised his eyebrows as Yulk paid for the drinks. Hope you stay on your feet after that, he said. It'll be fine, Yulk said. We're not going to be heading out immediately. If he ends up drunk, he can sleep it off. Yes, it's possible that Ten will intervene. That's cheating, Nash grumbled. Damn, Yulk saw right through me. I pushed the mug towards the bartender with a chuckle and heard a muffled voice. Toxin resistance unlocked. Really? That feels a little cliché. Well, I guess the cliché would be more along the lines of someone with superpowers being unable to get drunk because of a resistance to poisons, rather than unlocking it while drinking. As I tried to think of an example of someone gaining a resistance to toxins from drinking booze, an evil thought occurred to me. I just unlocked a skill, I said innocently. It's called toxin resistance. I stand corrected, Nash replied angrily. That's cheating. The sour expression on my adopted brother turned trainer's face filled me with a sick glee. Seeing jealousy twist his features completely made up for all of the recent bruising. Yulk chuckled and shook his head. Well, that's a handy skill to have, he said. I would note that it says resistance rather than immunity, though. I pulled up the skill information and relayed it to them. Toxin resistance. Allows a user to resist 25% of the negative effects of a poison or venom. It doesn't have a cooldown or duration either, I added. I guess that means it's always active. That does sound like a handy skill to have, the bartender said, grabbing my mug and putting it in a sink behind him. I suddenly became aware of how weird this must look to the poor orc. Something he's never seen before comes up to his bar, asks strangely coincidental questions about dungeons, then downs a mug of mead and gains a new skill. And in the face of these odd events, he's managed to maintain his professionalism. He didn't ask what I am or act suspicious of me at all. To him, I'm just another customer. I reached under my cuirass and pulled a gold coin out of my coin pouch. I placed the coin on the bar and slid it towards him. Thanks for the drinks. You can keep the change, I said. I didn't catch your name. Thank you, he said, smiling as he picked up the coin. The name's Jums. I introduced myself and the rest of my party while they finished their drinks. Jums took our mugs one by one and placed them in the sink that mine had gone in. Well, it's nice to meet you, he said. You're welcome back any time. Oh, we'll definitely be back, I laughed. That mead was pretty good. All right, we should go and have a chat with the Western Wasters, Nash said, sliding off his stool. While they're still somewhat sober, that is. You're right, I replied. Let's go. Mako, Haino, and Ithrima talked amongst themselves about what the receptionist had told us. He had said that even though it will take a while for a team of specialists to be formed, coming back was the right call. If we had tried to take on the vampires by ourselves, we would have almost certainly died and become part of the vampire nest. I know it was the right call, but Rebus and I felt a bit bad about it. In the time it takes for another team to form, more people will disappear and the nest will get larger and more dangerous. Part of us wanted to go back in to give it a try, an extremely stupid part of us, that is. To distract ourselves from these almost certainly suicidal urges, we'd been watching the overgrown lizard try to eat its weight in meat. It's a good thing the meat's cheap. So, you like the food? I asked the kobold. It replied with a stuffed face. Voracious little shit, isn't he? Rebus muttered. The kobold tilted its head at Rebus, and then unhinged its jaw to swallow what it had just shoved in its mouth. Rebus and I flinched in disgust as the chunk of roast direwolf slid down its throat. What mean? It asked. That word? Voracious. It means someone or something that eats a lot, I clarified. Is I eating too much? Nah, Rebus chuckled. The meat here is pretty cheap and you probably saved our asses. So eat up. Can I just eat regular? Don't know how to eat up, it said, lifting its head and pointing its snout at the ceiling. Maybe can. What's that thing? The kobold shifted its head to look at the group approaching us. I had been keeping an eye on the outsiders the moment they'd entered, but they'd headed straight for the receptionist and hadn't caused a fuss. They were dressed as adventurers, not hunters, but it isn't uncommon for people from the AG to come around. Still, some of the groups closer to them had looked pretty shocked. I wasn't able to tell why, though. Maybe one of the elves is famous or something? Come to think of it, a pair of orcs with a pair of elves is kind of an odd sight around these parts. You should know this one. Those are orcs and El. Rebus stopped talking as he got a better look at the group. Actually, you're right. The fuck is that? There were indeed two orcs, but one of the elves looked off. As they walked up, I did a quick comparison and noted several discrepancies between it and the other elves. First, round ears. Second, wrong facial architecture. Third, its smile showed a few sharp teeth that shouldn't be there. Probably not an elf, I muttered. Hello, sorry to intrude, the not elf said. We were told that you were just inside the nearby dungeon and found some vampires. We were wondering if you'd be willing to share some intel with us. Hino, Mako, and Ithrima turned to face the newcomers. Each of their eyebrows rose once they got a good look at the one speaking. The silence started to get uncomfortable, so I interrupted the awkward moment by sliding a chair towards the group. Sure, but intel isn't free. Buy a round and we'll chat, I said. The non-elf thing took the chair while the rest of its group grabbed some more, and before long we were all sitting together. Once everyone was settled, I waved an order of drinks to the receptionist and gave a brief summary of the events that took place in the dungeon, including how we ended up with a kobold. So, at least 7 vampires then, one of the orcs said. That'll be tough. Tough is an understatement, brother, the other orc said. It'll be hard for Nick and I to pin that many vampires down long enough for you and Olmyra to blast them. The odd group began discussing entering the dungeon, and the rest of us settled into another awkward silence. I glanced at my party members, but they were still trying to figure out what the thing in front of us was. Even the drinks arriving didn't snap them out of it. I took a swig of the mead and sighed. Well, since the rest of you aren't going to ask, I might as well, I said. Don't mean to be rude, but what exactly are you? I'm a human, it said. And that is? The human laughed and provided a summary of the events that led to him being here, introducing his party as they became relevant to the story. Nick, a human found in one of the unified chiefdom's dungeons. Nash and Yulk, brothers from the famed Alta clan that had found and resuscitated Nick. Finally, the one that kind of set things on edge, Olmyra the Eternal. When Nick got to her part of the story, Olmyra looked nervous. Once she was introduced, it was easy to see the reason for her nerves. Here we were having drinks to lament our vampire problems when one strolls in and sits down with us. I almost laughed. So what do you think, Gally? Mako asked. I think it's fine, I said. I've heard a lot about the Altas. From what I've heard, they're not easily duped and don't associate with bad actors. Plus, she's kinda hot if you ignore the age difference. No offense, milady, Rebus said with a laugh. I am Rebus Oltha. This here's Gali Marathi. The other dwarf is Hino Trant. Mako Muko is the big-ass orc, and Ithrima Solal is our token elf mage. Token? You little shit, Ithrima said with a growl. Again? Hino asked. Do you actually have some sort of grievance against our height? What? No, that's not what I meant. It's just a phrase, she almost shouted. Rebus and I laughed as she attempted to explain exactly what she meant by little shit. After a few stuttered sentences, she realized that the 3 of us were poking fun at her and started sulking. I finished my mug and looked at Nick. We're the Western Wasters, I said. We're named that because we're from the West and we usually hunt in the wastes. Lately we've been hunting in the dungeons, though. Makes sense, Nash said. So, are you going back in? Yep, the kobold beamed. Gonna kill the suckers. We has to help the Lord. Wow, it really does talk, Nick said. Yeah, it does, I grumbled. Too much, in fact. Anyways, we don't plan on going back in. We're handing the job off to a more experienced group, a specialist party. How long do you think it'll be before they're ready to go in? I don't know. Might take a week or 2 for word to spread far enough to find the right hunters for the group. Then it'll take some time for them to get here, get equipped and acquainted, and finally get to hunting the vamps. Why? We need to explore the dungeon, Nash said. That dungeon's probably one of the cult's former hideouts, and they might know how to get Nick home. We're hoping some clue may have been left behind. If there's nothing, we'd like to know as soon as possible so we can move on. Well, we'd love to help you out, but we don't work for free, Rebus said. Plus, we'd need at least 3 more mages that know fire spells. Maybe another fighter to help pin the vamps down, too. Would fireball work? Nick asked. Rebus and I glanced at each other and then at Nick's hip, where a sword was sheathed. Yeah, Any spell that can light a fire hot enough to start burning flesh would work, Rebus said. Why? Because Yulk and I know fireball, and I'm pretty sure Olmyra can use fire magic too, Nick said. Right? That's correct, the elven vampire said. So that's 3 mages and a fighter, Nick continued. How much do you charge? Shit. What are the odds of someone being able to use both sword and spell? Rebus glanced at me, making me responsible for setting a price. I sighed and gave it some serious thought. The price needs to be high enough that they can't afford it, but not so high that we end up looking like greedy bastards. That will let us save face while also keeping us out of the dungeon. 2 gold for each of us, I said. A little high, but it's going to be a pretty tough job. So 10 gold all tog. I was cut off by the sound of 10 gold pieces hitting the table. Mako laughed as Rebus and I stared at the glimmering coins. They were unified chiefdom and Balasir minted coins too, which had a higher gold content than Calcutan coins. No arguing our way out of this one. Well, fuck, I said. I don't want to do it, but the gold's on the table. You and your big mouth, Galley, Rebus sighed. I'm willing to give it a shot, Mako said with another chuckle. I think your force analysis was pretty spot on, Rebus, and 10 gold is more than fair. Ithrima and Hino were silent for a few moments. Finally, Hino shrugged and sighed. Fine, I'm in, he said. Might as well add vampires to the list of things I've killed. I'm in too, Ithrima added. In what? A well-dressed but road-worn dwarf asked as he approached. What did I miss? Hi, Leith, Nick said. We found a likely dungeon, but it's filled with vampires. We're going to team up with the Western Wasters to clear the dungeon and explore it. Yes! Kill the suckers, for the Lord! The kobold shouted, raising a freshly cleaned bone into the air. What? Leith asked with a horrified expression.